Especially if you see people you don't know, would you make it a point to go and introduce yourself to them and just welcome them this morning? The Word of God this morning comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 23. Yesterday was the day of Epiphany and marks the last day of the season of Advent, the season of Christmas. On the day of Epiphany, we remember the day that the Magi come and worship Jesus. And I thought it would be appropriate for us to read that story in Matthew chapter 2. During the season of Advent this year, we've been reading in Matthew chapter 1, specifically the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And the story of the Magi comes immediately after in Matthew chapter 2. And it's really a story of worship. It's a story of worship. If you were here on our New Year's Day service, you remember that I said that this past year of 2017, I've thought a lot about success and what it means to be successful, especially in God's eyes. What does it mean to be successful? And I said a few things, but one thing I didn't say that I'd like to say is, my kids are young, but I hope that I don't define success in terms of how my children turn out. And again, I could be, we'll have to wait and see what happens because my kids are young. And I think we all want our children to turn out well, that things turn out good for our children. But one of the things that I've heard from people who are older than me is that, and I think this is true, when our children do well, that parents take more credit than they probably should. And also when things don't go well for their children, that parents also take more blame than they probably should. That for those of us who are parents, we have a really short time to raise our children. And after that, ultimately, their lives are their own. Like, we can't control their lives. As much as we might want to and try to, ultimately, we can't control our children. After we've done our best and we place them in God's hands, and then it's really their lives. And again, I do. For my children, all four of them, I hope that their lives go well. But whether their lives go well or not, I hope that ultimately I don't use that to define whether my life is a success or not. Now, don't be wrong. The few years that I have with them, we have 18 years. I wonder if it's shorter. The years of real influence when they're listening to you might be shorter, right? But one of the things that I've learned and I've taught, I guess I've said to myself is, what's one thing that you want to teach your children? If there's one thing, there's lots of things, but if there's one thing that you could teach your children, what's one of the most important things that you could teach your children? And I think the answer that I have for myself, at least, is I think the most important thing that I can do is to teach my children to worship. I think it's really important. I think it may be the most important thing that I can teach my children to do. And that's one of the reasons I believe so much in our children worshiping with us, because I do believe that we need to teach them to worship. And one thing that Jean and I have learned is, we'll watch our children worship and we're so disappointed, and we'll go home and we'll talk to them about it. But if we didn't worship with them, we wouldn't see that, and we wouldn't be able to speak into their lives and teach them to worship. But I don't know, kind of take it for yourselves and think about it. But I do think that maybe the most important thing that we could ever teach our children is to teach them to worship God. And again, Matthew chapter 2 is a story about worship. the Magi, they come to worship. And so, Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 23, this is the Word of God. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the Magi secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen in the east went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old and or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the Magi. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. This is the Word of God. Worship, how would you define worship? And there are lots of different definitions of worship. A few definitions of worship that I like. Worship is laying all that I am before all that He is. Worship is laying all that I am before all that He is. I say this every Sunday, that worship is a response. On Sundays, it is not we who initiate worship. It is God who is the one who initiates worship. It is God on this Sunday, this first Sunday of the new year. God is the one who invites and welcomes us into His presence in worship and in through His Son, Jesus Christ. It's God's act of love. It's God's act of salvation which initiates our worship. Our worship is simply our response to who God is and what He has done for us. Worship is a response, and this is true not only of God, but even for those who worship other things or other people. Again, whether it be a car, whether it be possessions, whether it be a person, worship is a response. It's an act of showing worth, right? It's giving that thing, that person, the worth that they're due, right? So worship is a response. I also like, somebody taught me that worship, if you can paint a picture of worship, worship is you getting off the throne of your life and allowing God to be seated on the throne of your life. And I've always liked that. I think that's a good picture of worship. Worship is you, if you're seated on the throne of your life, it's your attempt at being king of your life. And it's you stepping off the throne of your life, and it's you allowing God to be seated on the throne of your life. Like I said, I really do believe that Matthew chapter 2, this story of the Magi, teaches us about worship. But there are two people to compare and contrast in this story in Matthew chapter 2. And it's the Magi and it's Herod. I think a lot of times the Magi get attention, and even the star gets a lot of attention. But I think a lot of times Herod doesn't get a lot of attention. I think Herod kind of falls into the background. And I think Herod is actually a real central figure in this story of the Magi, but not only the story of the Magi, but Matthew chapter 2 in its entirety. And I think it would be beneficial for us this morning for us to look at the person of Herod. But for us to understand the story and the person of Herod, we need to see the story as a whole. Most of you, if not all of you, know this story of the Magi. And a lot of you have a picture of what this event would look like. But this morning, I want to take a look with you at the text, at the Bible. And I really want our image of this story to be informed by the Bible. And I'm going to challenge a lot of your traditional assumptions about this story this morning. So first of all, we're told that Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. So hey, Mark, if you can give me that slide, the map, just so that you have a better idea of the geography of today's story, you'll see that under Palestine, you'll see Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And Bethlehem is located just south of Jerusalem. The Magi, we're told, they come from the east of Jerusalem. Well, the first thing, and I've said this before, is the traditional assumption is that there are three Magi. But nowhere in the story in Matthew chapter 2 are we told that there are three Magi, right? We're just told that there are Magi. They are plural. The reason that we assume that there are three Magi is because there are three gifts, right? But some church traditions actually think there are 12 Magi. Some people think there are only 2 Magi. We really don't know. And so that's the first thing. Second, in most Bibles, the word Magi is translated wise men, right? So, but what's a wise man? It's a real, I don't know if it's a bad translation, but I mean, it's like, there's a lot of uncertainty about what who the Magi are, right? But I don't know if wise men really helps. Right? So what's a wise man? Like, what are wise men? It's like they're smart. It's just kind of difficult. And so one of the translations for Magi is wise men, but another translation is king. That some traditions actually think that these Magi are kings. And so the children, they sing a traditional hymn. It's called "We Three Kings of Orient Are." We three kings. I don't think they're kings. So who or what are the Magi? And again, there's a lot of uncertainty about who the Magi are. My best guess is that they are priests. They are priests, and clearly they study the stars. Clearly they study the stars, and that through the stars, they are astrologers. They are astrologers. They can predict the future. They're told things, through the stars. So the first thing I'll say is, I just like the word Magi. I think, so I use the word Magi, and again, we don't know exactly how many there are. And then we're told that when they come to Herod, they say in verse 2, "For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, there are two different translations. There's an alternate translation for "when it rose." And in the bulletin, you'll see the alternate translation that I placed in there. And it's possible to translate those words as "in the east." "For we saw his star in the east," or "when it rose, and we have come to worship him." Now, traditionally, there's this idea that the Magi literally followed a star to Jesus in Bethlehem. Like literally every day, every night, they saw a star in the heavens, and this star led them to Jesus in Bethlehem. And I'm pretty certain that that's not what happened. And the first clue is that we're told that the star was in the east. Now, it's possible that you can translate that phrase "when it rose," but I do think that it's translated best "in the east." But again, in order for the Magi to find Jesus, they would have to travel west. Right? They would have to travel west. So I don't think that they literally followed this star as a guide every day. And I've said this before during the season of Advent, but what I think is that there was a planetary conjunction. God moved, literally this is a cosmic event. God controls not only the world, this earth, but God controls the universe. And God, He takes the planets and He moves them, and planets and stars come into line, and they form a new star, right, in this conjunction. And this star is in the constellation of Israel. And so these Magi, they see this new star, one of the stars, which is Regulus, the star that represents kings, and also Jupiter, which is a king planet. And so when they read this conjunction of planets and stars, Regulus, Jupiter, in the constellation of Israel, they interpret that new star as a king has been born in Israel. And so it is a guide. The star is a guide, but not in that it literally guides the Magi every day, but it tells them that a king has been born in Israel. And if you're the Magi, and if you believe that a king has been born in Israel, where would be the most logical place to go? You would go to the capital of Israel, right? You would go to Jerusalem. And so they saw this new star and this constellation, and they follow it in what it says, and they go to Jerusalem. The reason they go to Bethlehem is not because the star tells them to go to Bethlehem, but the reason they go to Bethlehem is because Herod tells them to go to Bethlehem. In verse 8, we're told, and he, Herod, sent them to Bethlehem. Now, if none of this is convincing, the most convincing evidence, I think, that this is what happened is found in verse 9. In verse 9, we're told that after listening to the king, they, the Magi, went on their way, and behold. Remember, when the Bible says to behold, it means pay attention. This is special. And behold, the star that they had seen in the east went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Now, this wouldn't make sense if the Magi literally followed the star every day. If the Magi had literally seen this star every day and had followed this star every day, can you explain to me why they would have rejoiced when they saw this star? Because they would have seen it every other day too. But if this conjunction of planets is what happened, and it happened again when the Magi find the child Jesus, but notice, this may be the greatest rejoicing that's recorded in the Bible. Because listen to their rejoicing. They not only rejoiced when they saw the star, but they rejoiced exceedingly. And that's pretty good rejoicing. But they don't just rejoice exceedingly, but they rejoice exceedingly with joy. Now, that's really good. But they don't just rejoice exceedingly with joy, but they rejoice exceedingly with great joy. Again, this rejoicing exceedingly with great joy just doesn't make a lot of sense if they were literally following the star every day. I don't think that's what happened. I think there was a conjunction of planets and stars that announced the birth of the King of the Jews, of Jesus. A couple of other things that I want to challenge is the assumption that the Magi came to the baby Jesus. Because if you read carefully, we're told, even from Herod, in verse 8, to search diligently for the child. In verse 9, the star went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. In verse 11, and going into the house, they saw the child and his mother, Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. There's a traditional assumption that the wise men, that they came to Jesus the same time the shepherds did. Right? When Jesus was in that birthing cave, probably, when he was laid in a manger. But probably isn't the case. By the time the Magi came to Jesus, Jesus was no longer a baby. He was a child. And how old do you think this child Jesus was? He was probably 2 years old or younger. Because we're told in verse 15 that Herod that he became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that Herod had ascertained from the Magi. So it seems that Jesus would be less than 2, probably older than 1, but around that age. Not a baby, right? But a child. And the other clue is in verse 11, we're told that the Magi, they don't go into this birthing cave or to a stable, but we're told that in verse 11, and going into the house, they saw the child, and with Mary, his mother. So just to challenge some of your traditional assumptions about this story of the Magi, the last thing I'll say is that in this story, we're told that 3 people come or want to come. The first is the Magi. In verse 2, we have come to worship him. Later in verse 8, Herod says, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. And the last person or thing that comes to worship, we're told in verse 9, and the star went before them until it came. The star went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And it almost seems like Matthew wants us to interpret this as creation, that the star itself has come to worship. Herod is a central figure in this story. Again, Herod is the one who told the Magi to go to Bethlehem. Herod is the one who forced Jesus to go to Egypt, which is extremely important. It's extremely important, and it's only in Matthew's gospel we're told actually that Jesus goes to Egypt. But it's extremely important because, one, it's a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. But second, it's extremely important because if you continue reading, in chapter 3, we're told that John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. And after that, we're told that Jesus is tempted for 40 days and 40 nights by the devil. So Matthew, in his gospel, in chapter 2, he has Egypt. In chapter 3, he has water. And in chapter 4, he has 40. So if you think of the Bible, and you think of Egypt, water, and 40, there's probably another story that you think of. Egypt, water, and 40. And the story that you think of is the Exodus. The story of the Exodus. The Israelites, they come out of Egypt. They cross through the water of the Red Sea. And they're tested for 40 years. And they fail. And what Matthew is trying to show is that Jesus is the true Israel. And that if anybody wants to be a part of God's people, Israel, it's only through the true Israel. It's only through Jesus. And that's why it's so important that Jesus goes to Egypt. But Jesus would not have gone to Egypt without Herod. Herod plays a real central role in this story of the Magi. When we're first introduced to Herod, the first 2 times we're introduced to Herod is in verse 1 and also in verse 3. In the days of Herod the king. And in verse 3, when Herod the king heard this. So we're told that Herod is the king. And Herod thinks of himself as the king. And this is important because when the Magi, when they come to Jerusalem, what they say to Herod is, "Where is he who has been born king of the Jews?" Jesus immediately threatens Herod. We're told that Herod is troubled by what he hears. A lot of times you'll hear this, especially in church, that the coming of Jesus, it's good news. And it is. The coming of Jesus is great news. It is good news. I'll say this, every time I read the Bible, I look for good news. It's my bias. I have to say I'm biased. Because every time I read the Bible, I want to see the good news. One of the things that I learned in seminary in my preaching class is that my preaching professor, he visited a number of churches just to kind of listen to the preaching in North America. And what he said is, what he found in the majority of churches in North America, instead of preaching good news, pastors are preaching good advice. And he says, good advice doesn't change anybody's life. Good news changes people's lives. And I think he's absolutely right. And so every time I read the Bible, I look for good news. So what's the good news in today's story? In Matthew chapter 2, what's the good news? The good news is that Jesus is the King. The good news is that Jesus is the King. And that he's King over your life and mine. Now, that's good news, but it's also threatening news. Especially if you are like Herod. If you think that you are king. It would be troubling. See, I think that's a good definition of sin. I think a good definition of sin is you trying to be king over your own life. It's you wanting to do the things that you want to do. Instead of allowing God or Jesus to be king over your life, it's you acting like you're king. That's Herod. Herod thinks that he's king. And so immediately when he hears the news about this king who has been born, he feels threatened. Now it's interesting because you can compare Herod to the Magi. The Magi, real examples of worship. Their worship is a response to what they see. We're told that they see a star in the east. And that in coming to the house, they see the child. And they fall down and worship. Again, worship is a response. And it's a response to what you see. Right? And if you want to be a better worshiper, you need better sight. And that's why it's a good thing to pray, God, help me to see you. Open my eyes, Lord. There's an old song, I'll open my eyes, Lord. I want to see Jesus. Open my ears, Lord, and help me to listen. If you want to be a better worshiper, you need to see better. You need to see God better. The reason the Magi are such great worshipers is because they can see the truth. They see. And then they lay all that they are. They give the very best to Jesus. They're great examples of worship. Now, Herod, why doesn't he worship? Because Herod believes that Jesus is the Christ. Herod believes the same thing that the Magi believe. Again, Herod, he's the one who told the Magi where to go because he was told by the chief priests and the scribes. I'll say this, Herod believed that Jesus was the Christ so much. That's why he killed those boys in Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger. That's how much he believed that Jesus was the Christ. He believed it just as much as the Magi did. But his response was completely different than the Magi. Why? What is it about Herod that made him unable to worship like the Magi and respond the way he did. This story is disturbing. This story bothers me every time I read it. Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Every time I read that, it bothers me. And one of the questions I used to ask is, God, why did you let this happen? And it's true that God allowed this to happen, but it's not God's fault per se. This is what Herod did. This is human sin. This is the result of human sin. So why does Herod respond the way he does, and the Magi respond the way they do? There's only one difference. Herod believes that he's king, and the Magi believe that Jesus is the king. If you think that you are king, your life will follow that of Herod. It will. And what do I mean by that? First of all, Herod, he believed that he was king, or he wanted to be king. So the first thing that you see, if you think that you're the king, you will be fearful. You will live in fear of men. You will live in fear of people. And you will live in fear of what people can do to you. You will live in fear of what people may take from you. When Herod kills the babies who are 2 years old and younger, it's not an act of strength. It's an act of weakness. It's an act of great cowardice. It's an act of fear. Because he is afraid of what people might take from him. Why does Herod meet with the Magi secretly? Because he doesn't want the chief priests, the scribes, he doesn't want the Jews to find out about this king who has been born, the Messiah. Because it's possible that they would take the kingship from him. If you believe, if you are living your life like your king, your life will be marked by fear. Fear of men. Look at the Magi. Look at Joseph. More than they fear man, they fear God. And because they fear God, they were able to live in obedience to God, in spite of Herod. And Herod, he was a bad man. If Herod found out what the Magi and what Joseph had done, the consequences you could only imagine. But more than they feared Herod, they feared God. Joseph, an incredible person in this story. Joseph, if you read carefully, Joseph is a man of faith and obedience. Above all, Joseph is a man of obedience. Rise, he rose. Go, he went. Flee, he took. His obedience is immediate. Joseph doesn't delay in his obedience. As soon as God commands, Joseph obeys. It's an immediate obedience. It's a beautiful obedience. I think that's true obedience. Obedience immediately. But Joseph is able to obey because he fears God more than he fears man. But also look at Joseph. Look at Herod. Herod, because he believes that he's king, he uses people for himself. And anybody who threatens him, he just gets rid of. He uses people. He uses the scribes and the Pharisees, the chief priests and the scribes. He uses them to do what he wants. And people, they're nothing. He doesn't care about people. It's all about him. So much so that he kills the babies, 2 years old and younger. Nobody else matters. If you're king, nobody else matters but you. And you will use people, and you will step over people, and you will even figuratively, if not literally, kill them in order to get what you want. Because people don't matter. I want to end by showing you something, though. As hard as Herod tries to be king, he's not the king. Because he's not the one who's in control of what happens. He tries. He tries to destroy the new king, which causes Joseph to flee with Jesus to Egypt, which we are told is God's plan. Herod, in trying to rid the world of his rival, he kills these babies. And even Herod's sin, he fulfills God's plan. And ultimately, even after Herod dies, right? Herod can't be king. He's dead. Even after Herod's death, we're told that Joseph goes to Nazareth because God's the king. That's God's plan. God is in control of everything. Dreams. Joseph has dreams. The Magi have dreams. God intervenes. God's the one who's in control. As hard as Herod tries to be he's not the king. And I'll tell you, as hard as you try to be king, you'll realize that you're not the king. You can try as hard as you want to control the things in your life. And when you're younger, it's easier. The older that you get, especially with our children, right? You just don't have control. As hard as you want to think that you're king, and as hard as you try to be king, you'll realize that you're not the king. The good news is that Jesus is the king. And I know that's a struggle, because there's a struggle against our flesh and the spirit, our will and God's will. But why is it good news that Jesus is the king? Because he's the king who has come to die so that his people can be with him. He's the true king. He's not going to put his people to death. He's going to give himself in death so that his people can be with him. He's the true king. What's the difference? I think the difference between Herod and the Magi is simply that Herod believes that he's king. And I don't know about you, but for me, I identify more with Herod than the Magi. I want to be like the Magi. I do. But the truth is, when I look in the mirror, I probably am more like Herod than I am the Magi. And I need God to help me to worship. And what I said about worship? Worship is getting up off the throne of your heart, of your life, and allowing God to be seated as king. That this day, this week, that this year, that it would be, that we would live lives of worship unto Jesus. Would you pray with me as we close today?